Welcome to Art of Caprice. So this series of videos will serve as a continuation from my previous series, Art of Etude, to which I'll leave the link above. In that I'll be covering another set of caprices that obviously nobody knows at all, the Paganini Caprices. So in this series, as in the last, I will focus specifically on a few key points or themes that jump into mind first for each caprice, so as to keep the videos short and concise. Let's get into it. So for number one, the famous arpeggio in E major, the first and most obvious thing that comes to mind is the ricochet stroke. And for me, the importance of developing a degree of control at a speed that is slower than the speed at which your bow naturally bounces itself. Like for this bow, the tempo marking is andante, so in a way there's really no need to rush as if you're up against a Lamborghini in a drag race. In fact, I'd always find it more impressive to execute this caprice at a slower speed and yet still give the impression of a natural fluidity in the stroke, as if effortless. In any case, it's useful to work ricochet at an almost unnaturally slow speed first for control's sake, and so that you may have that option as well, since everything gets easier from there the faster you go. So you can try it for yourself now. Just take the violin and go for a slow ricochet stroke like so. Could start with the arpeggio motion. Perhaps on one string, both down and up bow. So how does that feel? Chances are that you might feel a bit of tension, a slight seizing up in your bow arm in order to keep the bounce going evenly and consistently at a slow speed, especially at the beginning of the stroke. It almost becomes a subtle speed break action, and those who've watched Art of Etude will be familiar with this term. Of course, it's always desirable to be as relaxed as possible at all times, but nevertheless, the slight abrupt tension and equally importantly, the release of that tension that a speed break motion in the bow arm entails can become a tool in order to control the speed of an otherwise very hard to control stroke. Additionally, you can check out a video I did specifically on ricochet, link to which will also be above. So get more familiar with the feeling in the arm at this speed as you do it. Gradually loosen the wrist and fingers, and yet still keeping that speed break feeling within the arm for now. What's also important to keep in mind is a sense of anticipation in the bow arm, so that this part leads and this part follows, which is why it's important for the wrist and fingers to be supple. And then you can subsequently think of the motion of the arm in general as a bit of a paintbrush, like so. Next, gradually lower the intensity of the speed and break motion as much as you can without losing the bounce at the speed, and relax the forearm and upper arm as much as possible. So, starting with speed and break. At this point, you might realize that it really doesn't take much active effort at all to accomplish ricochet. In the end, instead of being rigid and stiff, the bow arm is supple. But at the same time, as a result of working this way, it's more likely to be reactive and ready to adjust at any moment. Now, something else to try is to group the ricochet into different groups. So for example, in 1st and 2, in 4, in 8, and another slightly harder way of grouping in 8, Next, the second thing that comes to mind in this caprice is a very general idea that can be applied absolutely everywhere, and also helpful for the mental process of learning a more challenging piece. When faced with a difficult virtuosic piece or passage within a piece, don't think virtuosity, but instead think character. In other words, to not treat virtuosity as the main priority and let yourself be daunted by the idea of or by the technical demand of virtuosity, but instead think, what character is this caprice going for? And what are some expressive elements you could bring out, etc. So in this caprice, what could be useful both for the sake of exercise and perhaps in a musical way, if you so choose, is the idea of emphasizing the contrast between the fluid, effortless ricochet on one hand and the various other elements that interrupt the ricochet flow throughout the piece, such as the dotted sixteenths. For the sake of contrast, these could be treated with a bit more of an incisive and actively controlled stroke, so less passive. And same thing with the chords. And the thirds also, later. In any case, it's good to think about what these elements could bring to the caprice character-wise. For me, I find there's something quite humorous about this caprice, something that causes me to not need to, take myself too seriously while playing it. And I also let that point me in a certain musical direction as well. Lastly, just a word about the left hand and intonation in this caprice. So for me, this was one of the first big obstacles due to the fact that the finger spacing for some of the chords, such as the very first one, lies outside where the fingers would naturally settle and in a more awkward position. But here's an exercise I do that could help internalize these finger spacings. So it involves lifting the fingers off the fingerboard and uneven rhythms. So I'll just go ahead and demonstrate. You start with one finger, usually the weakest finger. Find its position on the fingerboard and now continuously lift and drop the finger onto the fingerboard in various patterns. So first evenly. What about flicking now? Now try the opposite. Then, as a next step, you could jump back and forth from this position to the next. So between and so. And now try, as a next step, quickly shifting between those two positions. Having gone through this cycle, now add the other fingers one by one. And once in a while, you would just refresh and try and find the positions of all three fingers at once as a challenge. And so on. You get the idea. So using uneven rhythms as a practice tool actually also is very helpful for working the thirds later in the caprice. Or so the idea is not to move at all until the very last minute between the various positions. That's the challenge of this exercise. And speaking of thirds, there's actually an episode of Art of Etude that I made specifically on this subject. So I'll link it up above as well, so you can check it out. All right, that was just some food for thought. Hope that was helpful. And see you in the next video of the series for Caprice number 2.